Welcome to Brera, and welcome to our second dialogue. But before explaining why the second dialogue is important, we have to take a few steps back. We have to go back to the first dialogue. And why a dialogue? What is a dialogue in the first place? For decades, museums have been faced with a pressure to increase their visitor numbers. They've been faced with the pressure from governments, from sponsors to show that lots and lots of people came to the museum. And they did this, unfortunately, by making blockbuster exhibitions. Exhibitions that were created specifically with the goal of bringing people to the museum. But what happened, of course, is people came to the building we call a museum, but didn't come to the museum in terms of its permanent collection. They came to the exhibition. So you might have a lineup around the street, but people would flood into the spaces of the exhibition, see whatever had been brought in, because often temporary exhibitions were made from objects from other museums and didn't have much to do with the museum's own temporary collection or permanent collection. And they went away, and they never saw the museum at all. In effect, these exhibitions started to cannibalize, started to eat their own museums. They drew funds, they cost money, they took away resources, paintings weren't restored, research wasn't done. The money was invested in these blockbusters. We decided that in a museum like Brera, to create a blockbuster, to bring in something from somewhere else and stick it in a room at Brera, is almost an act of lèse-majesté. The collection here is of such extreme excellence. It represents some of the finest works in Italian art. It's almost disrespectful to do a blockbuster exhibition. So we decided to do something else. It's not really an exhibition. If you want to call it something, you could call it an inhibition. It's something we're bringing into the permanent collection. We've decided to call them dialogues because what we do is invite friends, and by friends I mean masterpieces from other collections, and invite them to have a conversation, obviously a visual conversation, with our masterpieces. The first dialogue was between Perugino's Marriage of the Virgin and Raffaello's Marriage of the Virgin, two works that had never been seen before together in the same room. And there they were, not having a chat, but you could compare them, you could see them, you could see the rhythms of Raphael being different than the way that Perugino represented figures. You could imagine them in the same time and space. And in fact, they were painted probably within 1 year of each other. These dialogues also let us do something else, because at a certain point, someone could criticize us and say, well, bringing in two paintings, well, that's not enough, and maybe it's not. So what we've decided to do is reinstall the entire permanent collection. Every time we do a dialogue, we use it as a way to reinstall, and reinstall the existing collection, to give the existing collection more clarity, to make it easier to understand for the visitor, to give it more drama, more emotional power. So in this case, we started with Giovanni da Milano, who is a medieval master in our collection, one of the earlier works in our collection. Starting there in a beautiful room of red, of a sort of Bordeaux color red, we move forward into the late medieval, late Gothic, and we find ourselves in a series of blue rooms. Why blue? Well, these blue rooms have a meaning. This blue is taken, in fact, if you look around, it's taken from the color of the Madonna's robes. It's the blue of the 15th century. We are now in Venetian art of the 15th century, in which the Brera has one of the country's, if not the country's, most important collection. If you take 20 paces that way, you'll find another blue and another century. Still Venetian, but 16th century. And the color alone, without a single word written, the color alone tells you you've moved from one time to another time. This new installation is much more dramatic, much more powerful, and it's supported by a whole series of new ways of telling stories about the paintings. 3 different kinds of labels, labels written by the curators, labels written by authors, famous authors, in this case Sarah Dunant, and labels written specifically for families and children to help them discuss and find things in the paintings that they might not otherwise see. Because what we've learned over the years and years is that the painting doesn't speak for itself, except in its most basic and elemental form. The painting needs to be read. Of course, you can see, for instance, with a mother and child, you can see a mother and child. But as my Chinese friends once asked me, well, who's the nanny? You see a mother and child. If you know that this mother and child is a very special mother and child, this is in fact Maria, the mother of Christ, that Christ plays a major role in the iconography of all of the Occident, all of Western Europe. If you understand that this is a very special kind of story, well, you start to see new things. You don't see them unless you know them. You cannot see unless you know. So labels help you to see more and to look longer. This particular dialogue is extraordinary. First of all, it's extraordinary because the painting at the center of the dialogue is arguably the Brera's most important painting. It is ranked as the most known painting in the collection by both foreign tourists and by Italian tourists or Italian residents. Mantegna's Dead Christ is, by anybody's standards, an extraordinary painting. It's extraordinary in several ways. It's extraordinary iconographically, it's extraordinary as a piece of technical mastery, and of course, it's extraordinary for what it shows and how it's done. How it's done is extraordinary because Mantegna was experimenting with new techniques. He was using tempera in a new way, very thin layer of tempera. He was looking at a way to create an impression that at that time, very few artists knew how to make. He was a technical revolutionary. In terms of the perspective itself, he was also a technical revolutionary. You look at that and you say, wow, this guy was understanding the newly discovered perspective in the Renaissance. And he wasn't applying it to a building where it's easy to draw. For instance, if we look at the paintings of Perugino, you see very strict perspective, but you're using a one-point perspective that's mathematically far easier than when you're drawing a human body. But then you have to ask yourself, well, it looks real, and so it should, but it's not actually a perfect perspective. If Mantegna had drawn that body lying on that slab in true perspective, the feet would be much closer to us and much larger, and they would have obscured the very emotional, look at his thorax, look at his abdomen. The feet would have been much larger. Mantegna deliberately broke the rules of perspective in order to create what is an extremely powerful representation, not only of Christ's suffering on the cross, which is now past, but of Christ's absolute humanity. Up till about the early part of, after the millenniums, or until 1200, there was a heretical movement, the Cathar, the Albigensian. There was a heretical movement called Docetism, in which the followers wanted to diminish the idea of Christ's humanity. They said, well, he's the Son of God. He wasn't, he was basically divine. So when he died on the cross, well, he's already the Son of God. What did he have to worry about after all? Now, quite obviously and quite rightly, the church was very unhappy with this line of argumentation and said, no, let's be clear. Christ has a dual aspect. Christ is 100% God, but 100% man. He's a human being who can die, because otherwise his death on the cross would not have any meaning, and it certainly wouldn't have a meaning within the framework of Christian theology. This is a painting that shows Christ's mortality at its most brutal. You see that the flesh is almost white like putty. You can see he is dead. This is a dead body lying on a slab. St. John, Maria are mourning. These are depicted with extreme realism. The tears are running down their face. Christ's death is absolute, and it's the death of a man. Without that death, Christ's divinity and his subsequent resurrection, would not have the power they do within Christian theology. Mantegna was doing what all great artists did, and that is taking belief, which is abstract, which is doctrinal, which is philosophical, and transforming it into a material image. This is the material image of the dead Christ lying on the slab. And that is more powerful than nearly any other description and any other reason you could give to the doctrine of Christianity. So this here, this image, obviously inspired generations of artists. We have two others in dialogue here, two very different dead Christ. You have Annibale Carracci's dead Christ, contorted. Clearly, in a sense, he looks much more, perhaps like a figure that was just taken down from a gallows, or there's a figure who is contorted in death. The blood stains, the blood is running down his belly, forming actually a connection, which is sometimes referred to as the blood tryst. The meeting of the blood of his side wound is running down to where he shed his first blood, which is circumcision. This is often seen in iconographic terms, so his first blood and his last blood joined together. Here you have the instruments of the crucifixion on the lower left-hand side, the tongs that pulled the nails out when he was dropped from the cross, the nails that were through his feet. Here in Borgianni's Dead Christ, you have another, slightly more spiritual Dead Christ. There's no blood. Maria and John are both there. The nail, only one nail, is in the front as a symbol of the crucifixion. The soles of his feet facing you are dark. You can't see the wound. But all three of these paintings speak to each other. They speak to each other across time, across doctrine, and across technique. So here we have a dialogue that allows us to anchor the real installation of an entire section of the Brera, and of course is the second, and by being the second, you can expect a third, and that will be the dialogue that lets us speak about Caravaggio and the Supper at Emmaus.